Hi, I'm Scott Althaus from the University of Illinois, and I am one of the principal investigators of the Responsible Terrorism Coverage Project. Along with me are principal investigators Hartmut Wessler from Mannheim University in Germany and Wouter van Adeveld from the Free University in Amsterdam. We also have a large team assembled to do the work of this project, and so what I'm about to overview for you is very much a team effort that involves large numbers of very important people who contributed to the overall result. Terrorism is a problem for many countries in the world, and in many ways, terrorism is a problem of communication. So it's important to define what terrorism is in order to understand the strategic communication incentives of groups that try to use this. Terrorism is a tactical choice. It's a choice among many choices that could be made by non-state actors who are pursuing political goals and make the decision that using violence is the best way to generate publicity. Publicity that has a certain intended impact. And that is publicity that exploits fear in a target population and that shapes perceptions across multiple audiences that will be favorable to shape for the organization or the group that uses terrorism tactics. The Responsible Terrorism Coverage Project is an effort to try to assist journalists in countries that are targeted by terrorist attacks to not assist the efforts of terrorism groups in trying to generate certain kinds of communication discourses by producing attacks that get covered in mainstream news. So our effort is to help journalists provide citizens with the kind of coverage that they need, because citizens need to know when these kinds of events happen, but without giving terrorists the attention that they want, without advancing the strategic communication goals that terrorist groups have in mind when they produce these violent attacks. What do terrorists want? Well, they want three things above many others. One is they want visibility. Terrorist groups want to draw attention to their own demands and their capabilities as a necessary condition for producing the political outcomes that they're after. If they don't achieve visibility in larger news discourses in a target country, then they can't achieve anything at all. Besides visibility, they also want legitimacy. They don't want to be called terrorists. They want to be seen as legitimate actors with grievances that should be taken up by mainstream political institutions and organizations. And they really want to elevate their grievances into these larger public discourses as a way to legitimize the concerns that are animating their activities. They also want prestige. They want to be seen as a credible threat to public order, and they want to be seen as being taken seriously by political institutions. And the prestige goal is really a communication goal that is internal to some of the spaces that these violent non-state actors operate, because they want to be seen as relatively more important and more credible than other violent non-state actors. And if they can achieve those goals, then they can improve their fundraising, they can recruit more members, and there are a number of other internal communication goals that get satisfied when one group gets elevated and is seen as occupying the attention of target institutions and countries. But terrorist groups also need to achieve political leverage. And to do this, they have to try to move populations in order to generate pressure that will produce the political outcomes that they want. There are many different strategies that could be pursued in doing this by violent non-state actors, but two of the most important are scaring a target population by elevating levels of fear that the terrorists have a lot of power to do more bad things, and that this is going to pressure governmental leaders to capitulate to terrorist demands. Besides scaring us, they could also piss us off. This is generating outrage and anger that motivates governments to overreach and overstep in response to these activities, these violent acts, in ways that actually further the political goals of the terrorist groups that are generating these acts. So either by scaring us or by pissing us off, terrorist groups hope to achieve leverage in getting the political outcomes that they want. And the question for our project is whether terrorist groups are getting what they want. So we had four main goals. The first is just defining what responsible news coverage of terrorism looks like from different theories of democratic politics. We didn't want our recommendations and our insights to be restricted to one country or one way of thinking about democratic politics, but to be applicable globally so that that organizations, individuals, news outlets in a wide range of polities could benefit from the insights that this project produces. We also wanted to develop a range of new software tools that would make it easier for us and for other researchers to do further innovative work on understanding the dynamic properties of terrorism discourse. And we wanted to produce publishable research that that looks at terrorism news coverage across long spans of time in multiple countries. That's very difficult research to do, and this was an important goal for this project to get some of this done. But the fourth goal is the most important because we knew that the 3-year time span of this funded project was not going to allow us to accomplish everything that we could with the data that we generate. So the fourth goal is to release publicly the data sets that we use to generate our insights and put those into the hands of scholarly communities around the world so they can continue the good work that we started. So there are a number of data products that are coming out of this project. One is a 74-year set of data from the New York Times that cover every article published in the Times about violent non-state actors. We also have extracted features from the Guardian newspaper in the UK from 2006 to 2015 that has a similar set of extracted features. We have a multilingual benchmark corpora for doing topic modeling across multiple languages that will be useful to researchers in several fields. And we have an extracted features data set for global news coverage that derives those features from the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, which is an open source information product that translates news coverage around the world into English, and the BBC Monitoring Summary of World Broadcasts. And in addition to those main sets of extracted features data sets, we also have several gold standard data sets that we use to validate and refine the tools that we developed over the course of this project, and we're releasing those to benefit the scholarly community as well. There are a number of software products that were produced over the course of doing this project, too many to name and to mention in any detail, but at the end of this video there will be a link to the GitHub page where all of our software repository rests, and anybody who's interested can follow up there with the tools that we generated in this effort. Just a couple things to mention. We had to work with syntactic dependency trees in order to link actors to specific quotes and statements about terrorist activity so that we could get down to a very fine-grained level of understanding how terrorism-related discourses operated across multiple types of news. We also had to look at changes in topics over time across multiple languages. And instead of relying on standard approaches of machine translating multiple languages into one standard language like English, which suffer from the problem that these machine translations are still not as good as human translations, we worked to develop some new methods to use word embeddings within the original languages to compare and track over time the changing topics that showed up in news discourse. We had a number of insights that have come out of this project. One is looking at 74 years of New York Times coverage. We found that coverage of terrorism has been remarkably consistent and stable across 74 years from 1945 to the end of 2018. We looked at over 190,000 individual terrorist events that were cataloged by the Global Terrorism Database. And we aggregated those into weekly units and found that the variation in lethality, in the number of events, in the location of these events, could generate statistically detectable effects on New York Times coverage, but almost, well, always, those effects were substantively very small. That these events just didn't move the dial very much in changing the nature and the shape of New York Times coverage. And this suggests that quality journalism, like the kind of journalism practiced by the New York Times and many other broadsheets around the world, may serve as a societal resilience factor that helps to mitigate the strategic communication goals of terrorist groups, to help to filter the kinds of communications that terrorists are hoping to generate out so that the information that flows through targeted societies lacks the key features that terrorists are trying to produce. And here's an example of just looking at the 74 years of New York Times coverage, and you can see that levels of anger over time and levels of fear over time have remained remarkably stable. Though over the course of the 74 years, there have been very large changes in the severity and the number of terrorist-related incidents over time. The emotional tone of New York Times discourse about violent non-state actors has not changed considerably. We also topic modeled the entire set of New York Times stories, and you can see this very colorful graph behind me shows the changing topics over 74 years. But the basic story here is also pretty similar. If we look at the mix of topics that shows up in any given year over the last decade in the New York Times, it looks like the same mix of topics that would have showed up in any year over the decade of the 1950s. There's not a lot of change that's been happening in the mix of topics that shows up in the Times. There are further insights that the project has developed. One is that when you mix discourses about terrorism, Islam, and refugees, as happened in the Syria refugee crisis, which was a case study for this project, looking at multiple news outlets in multiple languages in the Middle East and in Europe, that is likely to change the emotional tone of that coverage in ways that generate spillover effects that reduces the news coverage, the level of sympathy and empathy associated with refugees. And that's an important, probably unintended effect of mixing these discourses in the same kinds of news stories. We also found that relative to non-Western media, Western media tend to report on terrorist events that are perpetrated by Islamist groups more negatively than they do terrorist events that are perpetrated by right-wing political groups. We looked at the Guardian's coverage in detail, and this was part of our project to try to link the individual records in the global terrorism database to individual news stories in a news outlet. And we found that in order to do this well, we had to first separate out parts of the world that have high and chronic levels of terrorism in order to focus on the parts of the world where these events were somewhat more uncommon. And that's simply because in places like Iraq and Afghanistan over the period that this data were collected, there are so many events going on that it's difficult to identify whether one of maybe a dozen in a given day was actually being referenced in a particular news story. But once we separate out those parts of the world, it becomes much easier algorithmically to accurately and validly identify when a particular attack is being mentioned in a particular news story. The project ended up with a series of recommendations for journalists and for social media users of how not to advance the strategic communication goals of terrorist groups. And we are very grateful for the funding that was provided by our very generous funders across 3 countries as part of the Transatlantic Partnership Digging into Data grant competition. And we invite you to come to our website and our GitHub page to explore more the data, tools, and insights that have been generated by this project.